Hello and welcome to this video. I'm Father Robin Koning. I'm the Provincial Assistant for Vocations for the Australian Jesuit Province, and with me is the Reverend Julian Butler, one of our Jesuit scholastics, one of those most recently taking vows in the Society of Jesus in Australia. In this time of pandemic, we're doing a bit more social media stuff, and we've brazenly stolen this idea from our American Jesuit confreres, who are making videos called Jesuit Lunch Hour, where they are having conversations with Jesuits about Jesuit life for 12 or 15 minutes each. So taking that idea, I'm calling it Jesuits having a cuppa. For those who are not Australians or British, having a cuppa, I think in England it pretty much refers to having a cup of tea. Here in Australia it tends to be more broadly a cup of tea or coffee or Milo, whatever, but just having a conversation about Jesuit life. Normally I'll be the one guiding these interviews, but I thought I should be in the hot seat myself first off so that I experience what others will be doing. And so Julian has kindly joined us to lead us in these interviews. And it'll really be a bit of a conversation about my own vocation story, Jesuit life, whatever Julian throws at me, really. So I'll hand over to him now and have a sip of my cuppa. The other advantage of having a cuppa when you're doing this is it gives you something to hold on to if you're feeling a bit nervous. So over to you, Julian.
Thanks, Father Robin. We might start at the start of your Jesuit vocation. Would you tell us what initially attracted you to the Jesuits? What led you to joining the society?
Sure. Okay. When I'm talking to people who are thinking about Jesuit life, they ask me my own story, which I'm happy to share, but I tell them it is rather different from the story of most people who join these days, because I joined probably at the tail end of the time when quite a few people joined straight from high school. In fact, in our Australian Jesuit province, I'm the last one who joined the society straight after high school and who has still stayed. There were some who joined later and discerned different paths, but I joined way back in 1977 after high school. What attracted me, once I was clear that I felt drawn to being a priest, and that was probably in my last year of high school, where what had been a thought amongst other thoughts of what I might do clarified a bit. I started looking at what sort of priest I might become. I didn't know too many religious orders, but that had always attracted me, the idea of life in community. And at home we used to get magazines from the Columban missionaries and the Divine Word missionaries. So my sense at that stage, as a youngish teenager, was that missions, overseas missions, was where the action was, and I was looking at missionary orders originally, having read the stories during my childhood of different missionaries and the work that they were doing. So I didn't initially look at the Jesuits. I was looking at the Divine Word missionaries and the Columbans, until a friend of my parents came out from Holland, from the Netherlands, and a friend of theirs who was Dutch, who'd been to a Jesuit school in Amsterdam, he said, "Have you considered the Jesuits?" And I said, "Oh no, I'm looking at missionary orders." And he said, "Well, they do missionary work," and that was a new thing to me. I suppose I realized that, but I'd been focusing just on mission work. So I began to read about Jesuit saints, the early saints of the Society of Jesus, St. Ignatius, St. Francis Xavier, the Canadian Jesuit martyrs. And there I found men who were obviously very generally quite intelligent, would engage in the life of the mind and the life of meaning making, engage with other cultures, engage with the world, but also had this passionate commitment to Christ, such that they were willing to go to their deaths for their wanting to share the message of Christ and the gospel. And I was interested in schoolwork I did pretty well at, and was interested in intellectual things, and I realized the importance of Christ being at the center of what faith is about. And so that holding together of faith, a strong faith, a passionate faith in Christ, with the desire to engage with people and with the questions of the time and the questions of other cultures is really what attracted me. So I wrote to the Jesuit Vocation Director. I was in Brisbane, where I grew up, and I wrote to the Jesuit Vocation Director in Melbourne. He said, well, get in touch with these Jesuits in Brisbane. And that's as much as I knew about the Jesuits. I didn't even realise there were Jesuits in Brisbane. Not many, but there were some on the other side of town. So I sometimes say I have an excuse that other Jesuits don't have, and that I didn't really know too many Jesuits when I joined. But I got to know them, and that's when I joined.
So from that sense of mission and desiring encounter and for Christ, is kind of grounded for Jesuits in a long period of formation, longer than now. Can you tell us a little bit about that process of formation and what that was like for you, where you found life in that, and maybe some of the things that helped you to go and live that mission in your Jesuit life?
Yeah. It is still, to some extent, a long formation, and it certainly was then for people who came straight from high school. The basic priestly training is the same as for any priests, 6 years of philosophy and theology studies together. Then if you're in a religious order, you always have a year or two of, some orders have postulancy and noviceship, spiritual years where you're discerning whether you're going to go on and take vows. So that would be the same for other religious. Ours is 2 years long of those years. I suppose that's a point to make. When you join, it's you're fairly confident this is where you're called, but you do have that 2 year period of learning more about the Jesuits learning more about you, doing the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius as a key experience there, of discerning further whether this is really what you are called to do. So there's those 2 years, and then not having gone to university, I did university studies. I did a science degree at Melbourne Uni, majoring in mathematics. That had been my interest at school, and then my priestly studies. And the other thing which adds to our time of formation, I suppose most seminarians and most religious orders would have some time of ministry in the middle of their training. We tend to have generally a whole 2 years of full-time ministry. So you're not just being formed in a formation community, a studies community, you're also being formed in the heart of mission of apostolic life in a working community as part of your time. Where I found life and all that, I think part of it was the discovery. I did my science degree straight after noviceship, and then went in to begin philosophy and theology studies. And there I discovered that I quite enjoyed things like philosophy and theology. I tended to do sciences and maths more at school, where my interests were, but I found reading stuff and reflecting on issues I quite enjoyed. I remember Father Andy Hamilton, who was one of my teachers. One of my first essays I got back, and one of his comments at the end, which you probably couldn't write in these politically correct days, was, you don't write too badly for a mathematician. So I took that as a compliment, as it was intended, and so my journey from then on tended to be more in the philosophy and theology area when I went on to further studies. So that I found engaging the questions of philosophy, questions of what is the meaning of human life, the meaning of our existence, started to engage me. I suppose I had started to find the mathematics, I quite enjoyed it, but it had become a bit dry. But I found the theological and philosophical studies more engaging about existential issues and delving into the faith. And then the ministry years, I had some years at St. Ignatius College at Riverview, teaching and looking after boarders and coaching sport, and then also had a year in a parish in North Sydney. So a chance to engage in pastoral engagements, which I found very life-giving, especially in the parish. I enjoyed that very much. I suppose something about the long training, it's a bit different for seminarians, where the main thing you're heading towards is ordination. Obviously those of us who are Jesuits who become priests, which is not all of us, we do have brothers as well, ordination is very important. But it's not as though that's the first landmark along the way. We do take vows after our noviceship, and you are already a Jesuit at that point. You're already fully involved in community life. You're still being formed, but you're also involved in a range of ministries and the life of the community. So it's not just a a waiting period until ordination. You're beginning to live this religious life already, which is a blessing as well.
Mm. So from that period of formation and training, after priestly ordination, Robin, you had a range of roles in the society. Beginning, I understand, with time, sort of, I suppose, missioned in a way that would sort of have been kind of maybe something like what you're imagining as a child, but then in very different ways, mission to doctoral studies and to teaching and to administrative roles in the society. What's that kind of variety been like for you?
Yeah, a good question. I suppose going back to what I said about thinking overseas missions is where the action was, I think very soon in my Jesuit life I realized, that was a bit of a romanticized teenager's view of things. That was the place to go to get martyred or to do really heroic stuff. But as I began to understand more about the life of the church within Australia, I realized how much of a mission field a place like Australia, anywhere, is really. There was mission everywhere. So that faded away. That focus simply on overseas missions wasn't as important. But in fact, after ordination, I ended up being in a mission sort of situation. In an Aboriginal community, I was missioned to work in the northwest of Australia, in the Kimberleys, a place called Balgo Hills in the Broome Diocese, where I worked for 5 years. I had 1 year, first of all, visiting some of our guys working in Aboriginal ministry and being inducted into it a bit, and then 5 years there in a very remote community at the edge of the Western Desert, and which was the most stimulating place to be for someone fresh from ordination, as dealing with cross-cultural questions, learning local language, people there for whom English was a second or third or fourth language, seeking to enculturate liturgy, and being in a quite remote situation. But I found the theological questions came alive again at the level of, well, this is an important theological concept or message of the gospel I want to get across. I need to do it in very simple English or very simple Gugija, the language I was trying to work on, because I didn't know sophisticated Gugija. So that really forced me to think more deeply about those questions. So, well, what's really the crucial point here, and to be able to express it as simply as possible. But in terms of the range of ministries, I went from there to doctoral studies in Toronto. Then I was teaching theology for 8 years here in Melbourne, theology, a bit of philosophy. Then I was asked to be the assistant to the provincial of Australia and New Zealand, our province. Actually, the man with whom I worked when I was in the Western Desert there, he was my mentor there, and the parish priest with whom I worked. So I had 4 years of that sort of support role, very much supporting the provincial and supporting the guys in the province and the ministries as best I could. And now I've been assigned to be the Vocations Promoter. So it is a whole range of things. I suppose that's part of, it's pretty essential to Jesuit life. For St. Ignatius, that was most important that we be available for mission, wherever the call is. It's at the heart of the vow of obedience, is that we are given a mission. We don't choose our own missions. There'll be all sorts of conversations and levels of input into those decisions, but ultimately the provincial decides where you're missioned, with his sense of the needs of the whole province, also keeping in mind possible international needs. So we are missioned wherever we go, and that was part of what attracted me to the Jesuits, was the range of ministries that we're involved in: education, social justice, tertiary work, parishes, pastoral work, chaplaincies, overseas missions, spirituality, a whole range of different things that I found that attractive. But it can also be, it can be tough at times when it stretches you sometimes when you're asked to do stuff you might never imagine doing. In the year that I got ordained, the provincial put to me this idea of going to work in our northern community with Aboriginal people, which I was quite open to, but I never imagined myself in that scene. I didn't know a great deal about it. I had done a bit of work with Aboriginal people here in Melbourne, and but he put that to me, and I said, yeah, I'm happy to give that a go. It was certainly a stretching experience, but also a very enlivening one. But it took me somewhere which, left to myself, I probably wouldn't have thought of doing. So there's that blessing of it. The other one, I suppose, was when I was asked to be the socius, the assistant to the provincial. Again, something I'd never considered. The provincial spoke to me at one point, asked me if I might consider this, and then we had another conversation. You know, he said I was one of the names they were considering. We had another conversation, talked a bit more about it, and I said, you know, so how many other people you're actually considering for this role? He said, well, actually, you're the only one that I'm considering. So again, I didn't think I was ideal for the role, but I was asked to do it, and gave myself to it. A very different kind of role from teaching theology or being in an Aboriginal community, and yet something I think I was able to contribute something to it, and it again stretched me beyond where I may have thought I would want to go. So there's a challenge in all that, and a challenge to partly to trust sometimes that provincials or superiors might see possibilities for what you might do that you wouldn't consider yourself, but to continue being available, to be ready to move to the next place, the next mission.
You touched on at the beginning and just in that answer, but your role now as vocations director for the Jesuit province here in Australia and in New Zealand. Just to unpack a little bit about that role, what you do, and particularly what gives you joy from doing that work. What's joyful about the current ministry?
Yeah, I think that's pretty easy for me to name. It's one of those roles that maybe the one in which I most clearly have had a sense of this desire coming up in prayer to be involved in this sort of work, and bringing that to the provincial as I was coming to the end of my time as his assistant, and him finally discerning that might be right. And at the heart of that was, I suppose I believe in this life. I mean, not just Jesuit life, but priesthood, religious life of all sorts. I see the value of it, the witness of this, what is quite a countercultural life in many ways. I see the value of that. I'm very grateful that the Lord called me to this and has sustained me in it. And I've also been involved with young adults in different ways. When I was studying in Toronto, I was involved in the university chaplaincy there at the Newman Centre at the University of Toronto, and found that very enlivening. And when I came back here and was teaching and as socius, I tried to be involved with young adult groups where I could be. I didn't have a lot of time to give to that, but I found that engagement with young people, wrestling with questions of faith, seeking to grow in the faith, quite life-giving as well. And I suppose, so those two things together, enjoying engaging with young people and having a sense of the value of this life, which, you know, a lot of people can't see much point in, or see as being quite restrictive, or not a fully human life or something. I felt I had something to give there. What gives me life is that ongoing engagement. You know, a certain amount of my time is following up people who've directly made inquiries about the society and the life of a Jesuit and want to pursue that, and helping them to discern. But a large part of it is simply being around in young adult Catholic scenes, being present, letting people know about the Jesuits, sharing our story, just getting the word out, I suppose, and being present and encouraging other Jesuits to do that as well. So that's the bulk of the time goes into that, and then there's the different levels of inquiry. Some people come, they're not necessarily thinking about Jesuit life, but about priesthood of some sort, and they're discerning what that might be, and I'm quite happy to help them with that. Jesuits are meant to know something about discernment, one of the great gifts that St. Ignatius gave to the Church, so always happy to help people, even if they're not specifically thinking about Jesuit life. But that is the life, I suppose, is in those engagements, and the seeing people being generous, wanting to explore these options in their lives, wanting to serve the Lord as best they can, and helping them in that process.
You mentioned that that happens in the context of religious life, of Jesuit life being countercultural and that there's a sense from some, if not many, that this life is a little, not more than a little, very strange or different. Or what's the kind of the rub or the challenge of that in sort of talking to young people about religious life, and I wonder whether there are, this isn't necessarily a new thing. Are there Jesuit saints that you draw on when thinking yourself about those issues, or as examples for others in terms of recognising and living with the rub of what is a countercultural life?
I think in terms of the first part of that question, different people will come with different things that they might struggle with in Jesuit life. Obviously, the vows in any religious life: poverty, chastity, obedience. So not having, in terms of the negative side of them, not having access to your own finances, sharing everything in common, not having one-on-one intimate relationship with a wife, and what's the other one? Obedience. That's right. Not determining your own life, as I've spoken about already. We receive our mission. That's the negative side of all of them, and that you can't deny that there are things which one gives up in that, which are not, which one chooses to renounce. And they're all for, as some of our documents say, they're all for a greater freedom that we're called to, if we're called to this life, the freedom to be able to love a broad range of people, not through the prism of a particular spouse and family, but more generically, to not be too attached to possessions or to things, but being free to go. You could be sent to the Western Desert, as I was in Belgo, where it was a pretty tough life in some ways. There were not a great deal of resources, not a lot of variety of food in the one store that was there. The mail came before there was much happening in internet. The mail only came once a week, the mail plane. Long drives to go to a coffee shop would be a 350-kilometre drive to the nearest coffee shop or pub. So one could be sent to a place like that and called to be free enough to be able to embrace that sort of life, or it could be sent to the University of Toronto to do doctoral studies, or both. So that challenge of being free to take up the mission, and not just that I'm going to do this job, but that this job entails this sort of lifestyle that goes with it, at times when that can be more difficult. I suppose when I talk to people, some will be more concerned about the obedience question. They're a little bit older, they've made their own running on things. Others, it'll be the chastity question is a major one. Can they live this life? Are they going to be lonely in this life? Others, it'll be the poverty, not being able to bring your possessions with you, and the things that you've become quite comfortable with. I suppose I try to frame it. Ignatius was very keen on getting in touch with desires. What are the deepest desires of my heart? If people have approached me or are thinking about it, there's obviously something niggling there. So it's a matter of helping them sift out, there's all this other range of desires for things, for relationship, for deciding about my own life. But is there something deeper that I'm called to? In this context, I suppose I think of St. Francis Xavier. He shared rooms with St. Ignatius at the University of Paris when they were both studying there. He had a direction in life that he was going to have a career to help restore his family's fortunes. Very intelligent, a great sportsman, and a very generous man. He a man of faith already, but I think Ignatius saw within him that the sort of things he was giving himself to were not going to fulfill his heart. He recognized the bigness of Francis Xavier's heart, this huge generosity that he was capable of, and over time, as he had conversations with him and guided him in prayer, he really elicited what's the deepest desire there, and something that would be more deeply fulfilling than the things he was giving himself to, which were not bad in themselves. They were very valid options, but Ignatius recognized in Xavier something which was a capacity for enormous generosity, which we then saw lived out in Xavier's life. And he helped bring that to the fore as what was deepest within Xavier.
Well, Father Robin, you've talked a bit about that sense of Jesuit availability and that coming through in the vows. So thank you for being available to have this conversation. You said I could ask you anything I liked, and I've done that, and I hope that those answers have been helpful for other people too. And I'll give you the last word.
Always dangerous. Thanks, Julian. I appreciate that. We will have more of these for those who are watching this. Probably get Julian himself at some point. We'll put him in the hot seat. We have a Jesuit in forced quarantine in Brisbane at the moment because he's just arrived back from the States. I hope to have a conversation to a Jesuit in quarantine in Brisbane. We'll talk to one of our missionaries in India, a range of different experiences of some of the younger Jesuits, some of the older ones, more advanced on the path. So stay tuned. This will be available on our Facebook page, also on the YouTube channel. So please subscribe, or whatever you do in these things. I'm not quite sure if you want to see them come up for more episodes of Jesuits Having a Cuppa. God bless you. Bye.